Hello everybody, it's exactly 1:15 and I'd like to welcome you all to today's lunch hour lecture. First of all, before we get started, could I ask everyone who's here in the room to make sure their phones are switched off, or at least they're on silent, and to welcome everyone who's watching online and point out the link that's shown on the screen here, the link next to the word Slido, and this is the online forum for posing questions at the end of the talk. And the event code is 7550. Please jot that down because that slide's going to disappear in a moment. I'm the head of the School of Architecture, and it's a great pleasure. My name is Bob Shield. It's a great pleasure to introduce today's lecture by Dr. Priti Parikh from UCL's Civil, Environmental and Geomatic Engineering Department, where she's a senior lecturer. I won't attempt to summarize her entire career just in a minute, and I think it'll come across in the talk, but her background is in infrastructure and settlements in Asia and Africa, and a lot of issues in and around that domain. So please welcome Dr. Priti Parikh.
Well, firstly, thank you very much for joining me here, in person and virtually as well, in your lunch hour, which I know is very precious. And as Bob said, I have been heavily engaged in work around infrastructure. So I've trained as a civil engineer, I've worked in industry, I'm now in academia, and I'm going to share some of my experiences through working in the environmental engineering part of civil engineering, where our concern is to improve the environment, the built environment. Also as a co-director of Urban Sustainability and Resilience Center, where we look at the future of our cities, and also as program director for a brand new MSc in Engineering for International Development, where we talk about how engineers can become global engineers and change the world. So I'm going to share with you my discovery, my journey of working in slums. And why is this actually important? Well, this is important because we are sitting on a time bomb. So this is the first time in history that over 50% of our population lives in cities. To be more precise, actually it's 55%. And that has a huge implication in terms of the shape and direction of our cities, in terms of the pressure that puts on environmental resources, land resources. So if you think about slums, slums are characterized by legal, illegal encroachments. There's kind of haphazard planning or lack of planning. There's this whole sense of informality where residents from rural parts of the country would come and encroach and try and build a new life. Or some of those settlements actually are well established over the years and they are now flourishing communities. Slums are generally also characterized by very poor living conditions in terms of housing stock. So as you can see, very poor housing conditions, but also more importantly and fundamentally what concerns me is the poor kind of infrastructure and environmental conditions. So predominantly the norm is not to have access to very basic services such as water, sanitation, i.e. toilets, taps, access to energy, some of the things that we actually take granted on a day-to-day basis. And we are sitting on a time bomb because 1/3 of the population, urban population, lives in slums. So nearly 1 billion residents actually live in slum type or slum-like situation actually. You may call it shanty towns, you may call it favelas, you may call it chawls, slums, what may be it around the world. But there are over 1 billion residents who live in those type of conditions. And we are sitting on a time bomb because those numbers are going to increase rapidly over the next few years. And in fact, in Africa, there are parts of Africa where nearly 70% of the population live in those type of conditions. Now, for me, this is very frustrating, especially as an engineer. I grew up in India, the western part of India, which is very entrepreneurial, quite advanced in terms of business, on one hand. Also as a country, if I just talk about India, we have excellent universities such as the IITs, where we have top-notch engineers, for example. We have people who specialize in IT. We are a country who have made progress in space research, for example. So what really frustrates me is a country with this technical know-how on one hand, and advances that we've made. And generally around the world, advances we've made, for example, with ICTs. So why can we not solve the basic problem of toilets and taps? We all know how it works, so why are we not solving this basic problem? What are the barriers? What are the challenges? And for me, this has been a big sense of frustration over the last few years. And what I like to talk about or focus about today is the role of infrastructure. So it's infrastructure, infrastructure, infrastructure. And if we go back to history books, if you think about Europe, if you think about modern cities, so if you think about London, for example, it was actually the public health movement here which actually changed the scope and the face of the city, which actually has resulted in improvement of living conditions. So public health movement, so the provision of water sanitation services, infrastructure networks, has had a critical role to play. So why is this not then translating to the context of slums, for example, which is extremely resource challenging? Now, the interesting thing about the slum context is it's a context with high densities, high pressures, and in some ways you would think that if you had a concentration of population, it would be quite efficient to provide those services. So that's what I'm going to kind of share with you a little bit today as I go through my journey and discovery of how infrastructure has created an impact in slums. In fact, impact is probably an understatement, how infrastructure has resulted in a transformation in slum settlements. And this is London without infrastructure. So we may look at some of those communities and think, wow, the conditions there look really, really poor. But without infrastructure, this is how London would look like. And you can see that life would be very, very tough. You would have to spend a couple of hours every day trying to gain access to water, trying to queue up for loos. You'd have to kind of look at how you're going to charge your mobile phones without access to energy. So life would be very, very tough, and it'd have a huge impact on the environment and the built environment. So infrastructure does have a critical role to play. And in fact, it's infrastructure which kind of underpins the development of some of the major cities in the world. And I talk about infrastructure at great length, but is this what really people want? International development is known to be an area where we have experts and practitioners who come in and impose their views on residents. But is this what really slum dwellers want? So as a part of my doctorate a few years ago, I went off to India, spent a couple of months there, and I interviewed about 500 residents in 5 slums. And what I show here is actually a summary of kind of findings from 100 residents from one slum pocket, but the findings were substantial and similar across the 5 communities. So this is a settlement where basic services, infrastructure networks in the form of water supply, sanitation was provided, roads were improved, energy or electricity was provided. So this is kind of a summary of their shift of their lifestyle choices. So the blue line actually represents the conditions or the preferences of people before the provision of services. So the question I posed to the residents was, if you say had $10 and if you had to invest $10, what would be your first preference? Where would you invest $10 first? What would be your preference for option number 2, option number 3? Now remember, we're dealing with a context which is very resource challenged and limiting. So actually $10 is a lot. And also people know what they want in this context because resources are limited. So the blue line shows that without access to basic services, the kind of top priority for people or residents there was access to water services, sanitation, roads, electricity, storm, which is rainwater management or flood management, then moving on to housing, employment, land tenure, or clarity on land lease. So you can see that primarily the kind of first intervention that people were looking to was kind of what we call hard infrastructure, so kind of tangible infrastructure inputs which they felt which they could improve their life. Then the next question I posed to them was, well, if you receive those services, what would your priorities be? And interestingly enough, the red line, which shows the shift in priorities, shows that people then start thinking about housing, they think about employment, they think about land tenure, education. So somehow through the provision of infrastructure, there's this kind of shift from thinking about day-to-day challenges around access to basic services to then thinking about education, well-being, quality of life, and health. And this was noted just not in one slum, but all the slums that I've studied. So this is quite a consistent trend where people initially do want access to basic services, and then as soon as that access is obtained, then their priorities start shifting. And this is what contributes to a transformation, an aspirational shift. This is probably the first step to thinking about a world without slums. So how can we get people actually who are fighting on a day-to-day basis for survival, for very basic needs? So how can we get them now to focus on higher order needs, on quality of life? Actually, it is very simple. It is actually infrastructure which can achieve that. So as soon as you start providing the basic services, you actually free up people's time, which means they actually can be productive citizens, they can work longer hours. Also, if you provide the basic services, you find that there's a cleaner environment, health improves, people are generally more productive. Also, you find if you provide some of those services, then especially women who have to spend, say, 2 hours collecting water and who are engaged with sanitation challenges, have 2 hours free every day. And what do they use it for? They use it to send their children to school. So it also has a huge impact on education. And also for young girls who are also assigned tasks related to collection of water and disposal of water, their time is freed up, so, well, they can actually go to school as well. So you can see that through the provision of very basic services, you can actually free up time. You can actually shift people from lower order aspirations to higher order aspirations to start this process of transformation. But how do you really achieve this? So what I've learned over the few years is a couple of ingredients which need to come together. So it is about infrastructure, but it is about kind of maintaining some characteristics and features of infrastructure provision. So one thing is to make sure infrastructure is provided in an integrated way. So typically the norm in some parts of the world is you go and provide electricity, then you dig up the roads, you provide water. After a few months, you dig up the roads, you provide sanitation services, and this is not very efficient. So the most efficient way of tackling the problem is to be brave and is to integrate and provide all services combined and say, we are going to integrate services, provide all the services possible to you so that we can improve the environment. And the second step is to think about infrastructure networks. The easiest thing to do is to go into a community where you're not comfortable or familiar with and say, well, we can just provide a public point, a public tap, or a public toilet. So that may be the easiest solution in the short run, but actually it's not the most efficient solution. So think about it. You have huge densities, which means if you provide infrastructure networks, you have kind of a large number of consumers actually aligned with the network, so you can actually be quite efficient in terms of addressing needs of your consumer base. And I call slum dwellers consumers purposefully because I believe that they should be equal partners in the process. And with regards to slum upgrading, there's been controversies over which is the right approach or not. My take on it is that people need to be left where they are. So city governments have tried to actually uproot slum dwellers and move them out of cities, which is all well and good. But if you take a city like Mumbai, where 50% of the population lives in slum type or slum equivalent conditions, are you going to move 50% of the population out of the city? What about their needs with regards to transportation and employment? What happens to their productivity? How do you engage them as citizens? So just taking 40 or 50% of our city's population and moving it outside the city may seem easy, but it's not a viable solution actually. And there have been many schemes which have failed. So I'm a strong believer in actually providing infrastructure networks within the slum, keeping the slums where they are, keeping the layout intact. So you actually work with and you work around the slum layout. And as an engineer, thinking about what type of solutions, what type of technical solutions we could think of. So in our department, myself and colleagues work on kind of appropriate technologies and solutions which are relevant to the context and relevant to the needs of local communities, which would involve technologies which are suitable, which would involve thinking about local materials, use of local labor, but also think about solutions which align with the flow of land and nature. It's as soon as you start doing that, you have solutions which become more cost efficient. And as soon as the solutions become more cost efficient, it means you bridge the gap between affordability and cost. So remember, we're in a context where resources are very, very limited. And also, if you're working with a local government, which has to deal with 40 or 45% of population living in this type of condition, their resources would be limited as well. And another important thing is thinking about residents as partners. So getting over the syndrome, poverty syndrome, oh, these poor people, we can just walk in and give them a solution, be nice to them. No, it's actually going in as a professional, collecting high quality data, providing high quality designs. And I would actually take this forward and say you have to be better and leaner and frugal in this context. This is a very hard context. If you get it wrong, it has a huge implication. So if the residents pay £50 for a substandard product, they have to take it forward for the next 10 years. They do not necessarily always have the option of going back and buying product B. So actually you have to be better working in this context, I believe. So technically you have to think about innovation, you have to think about lean solutions, but working in partnerships with slum dwellers. So some of the projects that I've worked on, slum dwellers have been financial partners and have contributed to a part of the cost of infrastructure, which has been empowering because now instead of being a recipient or a beneficiary, now they are a project partner. So they have a take, they have a say in the design, they have a say in the layout of the infrastructure network. And my belief is that if you kind of follow kind of these basic principles, then you can use infrastructure to improve health, education, income, and housing, and transform living conditions. And thinking about this as scale, and for this I would also like to thank my father, Priti Parikh, who actually kind of steered me in this direction of kind of holistic view of city and infrastructure and engineering. So if you were to take a city, generally a city is formed, most of the cities are formed due to rivers and natural drainage paths, and somehow the cities drain themselves. If they did not, the cities would flood. So somehow we have mechanisms where cities slope towards drainage paths and natural kind of canals and other paths, and cities drain themselves. And another interesting pattern that was noted in quite a few cities in the world is actually quite a lot of slum pockets, which are shaded in black in this diagram, are located very close to the water bodies. And this is due to the fact that, well, people need access to water, so living close to water is quite a straightforward choice. Also, you find that land near a river sometimes is no man's land, so it would belong to the central government, local government, and there's kind of less control over the land, it's not private ownership, so people encroach on this piece of land. And in some cities, actually due to the risk of flooding, people do not want to live there. So there's a combination of factors which contribute to kind of growth or proliferation of slums near those drainage paths. Now, this is consistent and true across cities, even though this is just a visual from one city. But what does this mean? So in some way, it means that the slums are located towards the low points. So if you think about infrastructure improvements in the slum, within a slum, and if you were to then take it to another slum, and somehow connect it, what you'll end up with is kind of a very efficient infrastructure route along the river. And the river is the lowest point of the city. So in effect, what you could do is actually use this concept of infrastructure provision in slums and extend it to city-level sewers. Now, quite a lot of cities themselves do not have infrastructure networks. So if you were to be very clever and design infrastructure in slums and connect it into a network along the river, which is the most efficient network, you could actually start servicing other parts of the city. So the slums, instead of becoming a problem, actually start benefiting the city. And previously, I kind of laid emphasis on kind of networks which should enable individual households to have access to those services. And that actually has a huge impact as well. So if you think about water supply, for example, quite a lot of common facilities look like so, because there's a lack of clarity on who operates and maintains those systems. Who is responsible for this? Who manages the queue? Who manages cleanliness? Also, the implication, and in particular for women, is that they actually have to spend 2 hours or 3 hours queuing up to gain access to water. But as soon as you provide a network, as soon as you provide access to a household, it actually changes life. The cleanliness improves, women actually have free time, they're more productive, they're more engaged citizens. Similar situation with toilets, and yeah, I do have something against public toilets, I'm afraid. As you can see in this image, for example, the public toilet here is very public. It's located in the middle of nowhere. In fact, I think I'll find it very awkward to use it. I would not wish to announce every visit to the world. It's full of garbage, it's full of water. This is typical, that public toilets are usually located in places which are most inconvenient, actually, even though this is to address a very basic daily function. Also, no one takes care of them. And most of the toilets you go into, and I've been to quite a few toilets, trust me, in my career, and most of them you go into, it's a bit sad actually, but most of the toilets I go to, I look for basic things such as hand wash, and you do not even have hand wash. And just imagine walking into this toilet, you're more likely to have a risk of disease and infection, actually. So a lot of people try and avoid the use of toilet. Imagine trying to go this by yourself in the night. Not very nice, actually. It's not a pleasant experience. Imagine trying to take your 70-year-old grandmother who actually is less able. Once again, not a fun experience. So it's all well and good to say, let's stick in a public toilet, but public toilets have to be really well designed, actually, and you need to take into consideration the social, economic, environmental factors and institutional factors to do justice to this box here. So if you do get a chance or opportunity to provide individual networks, it means you can provide the networks and people can go off and build their own toilets, looking like so, which has a huge transformational impact, especially on women and girls. So I was talking to residents in 5 communities in India, trying to understand what they felt was the problem around public toilets. And the problems range from safety, which is now well documented, and there's evidence of actually violence, in particular against women near the public toilets. Issues around the lack of dignity, and that is actually very, very true. There's a lack of privacy, there's a lack of dignity. Also, it's not very convenient. Now, I'm not sure how you can actually quantify inconvenience. I'm not an economist, but it's just not convenient. And actually, there's a huge premium to pay for that. And sometimes you find residents are willing to pay a bit more for convenience. If you have to queue up, especially in the morning, and it's a busy morning, you need to go to work, there are fights, there are queues. It's a very unpleasant situation. It results in bad health, and it's just very dirty. Within the toilets, it's dirty. If you look outside, there's rubbish. It's actually very, very sad. I also did a bit of work in Mumbai, in Dharavi, and in another slum in Mumbai, working with colleagues at UCL from crime science and local partners in Mumbai, trying to understand a little bit more about this issue of violence and threat near public toilets. And I found that there were incidents of rape and assault, but the biggest problem was actually something called Eveteasing, which is actually hard to describe. It ranges from people singing songs and being awkward and touching, just putting people in a very uncomfortable position. And imagine if you had to use the facilities a couple of times a day and you were put in this uncomfortable situation, that would have an impact on your mental and physical well-being. And further discussions with them, I was wondering what could be done to improve the conditions. And some of the suggestions range from, well, actually you can improve lighting, you can provide clean water, you can clean up the toilets, you can improve the environment within and outside the toilets. And some of them said, well, can we just have a toilet in our house? So as you can see, toilets does have a critical role to play for well-being of women. Once again, these things are quite hard to kind of quantify. And once again, economists can advise me on how to do so. But how do you quantify extra sleep? So quite a lot of women and girls actually feel embarrassed to use those facilities, so they wake up an hour or two early so they can go and use some of those kind of public facilities. So how do you quantify the benefit of an extra hour or two of sleep every day? It's really hard to do so, but there is a benefit. What about kind of participation of women and girls? So both women and girls, if they're engaged with collection and disposal of water because there's no access to services, it has an implication of time. It takes 2 or 3 hours of their time, which means they cannot go to schools, they cannot be engaged in other productive activities. It also has an implication on their health. Quite a lot of women decide not to use those facilities at certain times in the day due to various risks, which means it has an implication on their health. A lot of women in slums actually suffer from stomach-related problems or digestion problems, which is partly linked to a lack of access to very basic services. And for quite a lot of those residents, toilets and taps is kind of part of modern life. This is their aspiration, that they do want to see access to some of those very basic and needful services. So on one hand, there's kind of an overall kind of benefit and impact to kind of women, but there's also kind of impact to family members as well. So through my work and talking to residents, I realized that through the provision of infrastructure, there's actually also a positive impact on health and education. Measuring, once again, health impact is very difficult because in those settings, it's hard to get access to high quality data. So I try to look at how much the residents spend on medicine every month. Because my thinking was, well, if they spend less on medicine, they have more resources, they can invest in other goods. Also, if they spend less on medicine, it means they fall ill less, it means they're more productive, they're more engaged citizens. So in the top chart, the first 3 communities are communities where water sanitation services were provided. And you can see there was a decline or dip in medical spending post the provision of those services compared to the last 2 communities where services were not provided. And similar kind of improvements were also noted in education. Once again, I found it a little bit hard to measure because how do you measure education? Do you measure it by attendance? Well, not sure if that's a good measure, for example, school records. So I actually decided to measure it by literacy and ability to read a newspaper in local language. And there's been a slight increase noted in the ability to read or literacy. But something interesting which came out of the conversation was that now some of the households have started sending their girls to private school. And that actually is a big leap in terms of sending girls to school, but also sending them to what is perceived as higher quality schools, actually. And visually, if you think about the transformation, as a result of provision of infrastructure, this is the transformation you see within the community. Once again, a similar transformation. What I found interesting, kind of looking back on some of the visuals was, well, the project was about the provision of infrastructure, but somehow there's been this incremental improvement in housing stock. So if you go back, you can see that actually the housing stock looks a bit better now. It looks improved. There seems to be now brick walls, and there seems to be building activity, which has resulted. So somehow, through the provision of infrastructure, there's been kind of this activity around improvement of housing stock. So I tried to kind of investigate or understand this a little bit better. So I thought it's possibly directly linked to income. So I tried to look at incomes, but no one was willing to share their incomes with me. So I looked at expenditure. So how much does the household spend every month? And which I call disposable income. And I realized that even if you take into account inflation, the first 3 settlements where services were provided, you could see a substantial increase in disposable income or expenditure of the house. And that could also be explained by the fact that, well, if you have access to basic services, you have a cleaner environment, you fall ill less, you have more time, you're more productive. So once again, you can see that the provision of infrastructure is also connected to sort of income and well-being. But the implication of increase in income is the households presumably now are investing in things. So they would invest in goods, they would invest in mobile phones, but they also started investing in improving their housing stock. So you can see from the slide, the top slide is before and the slide at the bottom is after. And you can see gradually the residents stay where they are, but they started to improve their walls and improve the buildings. And this is an incremental process which takes about 8 to 10 years. Now, think about the problem statement we had earlier, where we said 1 billion residents live in this type of condition. Now, if the governments were to go and build houses for them, let's say there was an average cost of £20,000. So just you can do the maths by yourself, £20,000 multiplied by 1 billion people. I don't think we have the resource with us. So if we were to go by the route of building houses for everyone, I don't think we can achieve the transformation we're seeking for. But if we were to invest a small amount of money into provision of infrastructure, and that people tap into the potent kind of wealth that they have, the untapped wealth, I call it, then actually you can start seeing this transformation. And then this transformation evolves to people thinking about aesthetics and architecture, people actually then extending vertically, so a single-story property becomes 2 stories, people trying to make statements, people trying to create enterprise and businesses within their house, whether it's a Swiss laundry or whether it's a shop. So this kind of extends into the principle of moving from lower order aspirations to higher order aspirations, where people start then invested in improving their quality of life. If you think about the amounts which were invested, they may seem small. That's about $3,000. This was a few years ago. But if you look at their income base, actually it's a pretty substantial amount. This is not a small amount for them to invest over a few years. And also the fact that actually through a scheme they have been persuaded voluntarily to invest this amount is also a big deal. Because those of you who work in the sector will probably appreciate that actually getting the community on on your side, and also convincing them to invest is actually quite a big deal. And the reasons for in this investment range from kind of issues such as comfort protection, but the number one kind of driver to this was the provision of infrastructure. So the residents felt that infrastructure was a driver which enabled them to invest. It was a driver which convinced them that now they should invest in improving their living condition. And how was this achieved? This was also achieved through a financial partnership. So for example, the residents actually chipped in to pay 1/3 of the cost of infrastructure, the local government chipped in to pay 1/3 of the cost, and then private sector chipped in. So this was kind of a financial partnership. Now the implication of that is the government spent only 1/3 of the cost of infrastructure, and by just spending this tiny amount, they managed to provide infrastructure, improve the living environment, but also see an improvement in built environment through this activity around improvement of housing stock. So in some ways I would argue that if you use this approach to transform slums, you do get a multiplier effect where you can actually transform lives. And if you look at the charts here, the top one is where there was no intervention and hence no multiplier. The second one is, the blue bar is the government investment, and you can see kind of huge investment generated as a result of this intervention. Similar results in the two other settlements, different multipliers, but the concept still holds that if you provide infrastructure, you can use infrastructure as a leverage to transform or improve slums. So I'm not going to go through this again, but basically if you provide infrastructure using the conditions or using the settings I've mentioned, you can actually improve health, education, income, and housing, and you can use infrastructure as a leverage to improve slums, which will then result in sustainable cities. Because if 1/3 of the population, urban population, is going to be living in this type of condition, there is a need to find approaches to improve their living condition. So I'm going to end here with a positive statement saying, yes, I do, in spite of the challenges, in spite of the huge numbers, I still wish and I do imagine a world which is without slums. Thank you.
Thank you, Priti. We have a few moments for some questions and from our online community as well. I think that code was 7550, I think, yeah. So I've got two questions here, one starting at the back, and then we've got one at the front.
Hi, thank you for your talk. I was wondering, you mentioned the words untapped wealth. Could you explain what you mean by that?
So with the slum dwellers, for example, they do not have formal employment, so they do not have formalized or regular income, but they do have networks, so they can rely on their family, for example. Some of them may have land, they would be engaged in agriculture, so they would have sources of income, potentially, which they would choose to tap into if there was a very strong reason, compelling reason for them to do so. So I felt that through provision of infrastructure, it kind of compelled them, or gave them a business case to actually tap into this informal network and generate investment. So that's how I call it untapped. Is the governments have not managed to tap into it. The governments have not managed to tax this income, for example.
Thank you. That was very interesting and compelling. What you didn't mention is the political environment in which slum development can take place. Is there a great deal of political local government resistance to improving and renovating slums as opposed to putting people into newer, shiny developments? Because perpetuating slums is perhaps thought to be a bad idea, and going back to, if like, institutionalizing biblical times rather than creating a shiny new world. Is there a big issue around that?
It does get complicated on a few fronts. So for local governments, the tendency is to still see slums as a problem. So it's seen as a blight to the city, it's seen as a problem statement, it's seen as this visually unattractive place, even though most of the residents actually engage in very productive activities for the cities, where they work in factories. So there have been schemes where the governments have tried to put residents in high-rise buildings, poorly designed, bad ventilation. Also quite a lot of residents have activities which kind of spill out into the street. So some of them would keep livestock, for example, or some of them would use street as an extension of the house, especially if you have a family size of 8 living in one bedroom. you use the street as an extension of the house. Or you have instances where families would use the area external for shops or enterprise or businesses or community activities. So somehow when you get a lot of planners designing these high-rise buildings, they do not take into consideration some of those factors, and hence quite a lot of residents then reject some of those kind of initiatives. Also, quite a lot of those initiatives tend to be relocated. So it means uprooting a well-established community. In some instances, a community which has lived there for 20 years, which has formed very viable social, economic networks, actually. So that's why this approach of vertical kind of extension of slums has not been met with success, or has had very limited success, actually. And I still believe that that perhaps is not a solution to the problem in some parts of the world.
Thank you. Hi, thanks. That was very interesting. You mentioned that there was, you're seeing that they're seeing an increase in not only girls in school but also in private education, and I'm wondering if that's just purely if that's mirrored in more boys going to private education as well, or if it's part of a larger kind of shift in maybe thinking about income and leadership and how gender plays into that.
Thank you. That's a very good question. So yes, you're right to point out that actually this kind of increment of shift in private schooling was noted both for boys and girls. But for me, what was quite exciting was the fact that, well, A, girls were now going to school, and B, they were going to higher quality schools. So you can argue that with disposable income, there's a general tendency to invest more in education in terms of time and resources.
A question here.
Hello, this question via Slido, 7550. Two questions. The first being, were there any difference that you found in long-standing versus new slum communities? And the other one about the buy-in as financial partners, does everyone have to buy in, and is there a shared benefit? So do you get something if you buy in, even if nobody else does?
So I think I'll tackle the second question first about financial partnership and buy-in. So the way some of the schemes worked is the slum dwellers would be a partner. They contribute 1/3 of the cost. And that money would actually be put in a separate bank account. So in some ways, there's this assurance that their contribution would be safeguarded. And then they would work with the local government and private sector, and they would have a role to play in terms of looking at the designs and layouts, and they would be more engaged. So the benefit for them was they were partners, they had a stake in the project. Another innovation in this project was actually looking at taxation. So kind of a carrot for the slum dwellers was, well, actually, if you take part in the scheme, then we'll provide you some form of legal document to say you hold a lease. And also, you will pay something called property tax, similar to council tax we have here, in small amounts. But the implication of that meant was that slum dwellers could actually then go and use that document to take loans from banks. So it kind of improved their kind of credibility as a citizen in the city. Sorry, could you come back to the first question?
Long-standing versus new slums.
Yes, there is a difference in the long-standing versus the new slums. With the long-standing slums, there is this sense of belonging, sense of community. There are well-established hierarchies. There's kind of strong leadership. Versus of the new slums where there's a lack of trust. So you do this a difference when you try and engage with members from a long-standing community versus kind of a new community. And if we were to start working in the city, what we would try and do is first kind of establish yourself in a long-standing slum, develop the slum and say, hey, this has worked here, so now you can come and have a look as a convincer, as a pilot.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? One more up there. Maybe that we'll finish after that.
Hi. Do you have an idea about the costs per square meter to transform the slums you showed before from what they were to what they are now?
I have an idea of cost per household, so this costs are slightly out of date. So the cost is around £200 for the infrastructure per household, per shack. Assuming they're all on the ground, they're small shacks. And I could try and convert them to per square meter, but that's the cost roughly.
So, well, clearly, this is a huge, huge subject, and I'd like to thank you, Priti, for bringing it to us. And it's a subject that no single person can tackle, but thank you very much for bringing your knowledge and your research to the audience today. So, on behalf of everyone here, thank you very much indeed for a wonderful talk.
Thank you. Thank you.